Okay, so this video is going to be a walkthrough analysis discussion format to look at Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, written in 1729. I'm going to try to mostly stick to talking about rhetorical decisions and choices, what these sentences and phrases and passages mean, versus giving a history lesson, although that's going to be difficult to avoid entirely because this is a historical document. But first and foremost, we want to understand that this is one of the most famous pieces of satire ever written. And he's actually known as the father of satire because of this piece for the most part. And so as we get into it, you have to keep that in mind, that this is meant to be kind of a scolding or to vent frustration that Jonathan Swift had of what was happening in his society. And this is why he wrote that, out of frustration and anger at many different elements in the culture. And so he was of the British upper class, and he was living in Ireland during a time when basically Ireland was a colony under British rule. And so you had overpopulation, extreme overpopulation, and extreme poverty, and tight control of the economy that Britain was benefiting from. So people were dying of starvation, the crime was rampant, all of these kinds of issues that came out of this. And so he puts this out. It's called A Modest Proposal. And so some of this is going to serve us to define some of these words. And so we want to understand modest means moderate, relatively moderate, limited. And so he puts this out as a modest proposal to set a tone here, as though this is not a very big deal, that this is reasonable, that this proposal that he is going to suggest should make sense, should be bought into, people should get behind it. And the entire title is A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People in Ireland from Being a Burden on Their Parents or Country, and for Making Them Beneficial to the Public. So this overpopulation issue, he's trying to propose something to help the extreme poverty and all of these really poor children that were just everywhere in the society. And so we're going to, as we read this, try to think about what is he satirizing here? What is he complaining about? Who is he accusing, and of what? So when we talk about satire, right, we have to understand that it is aimed at something cultural, and that there is something happening that the author is trying to attack or change people's attitudes about, or get people to look at, to spur them to action, to change. And so this is where we're going to start here. As we start reading, I'll read a passage and then we'll break it down a little bit as we go. It is a melancholy, right, meaning kind of a sad or woeful object to those who walk through this great town or travel in the country, when they see the streets, the roads, and cabin doors crowded with beggars of the female sex, followed by 3, 4, or 6 children, all in rags, and importuning every passenger for an alms, which is a handout, right? These mothers, instead of being able to work for their honest livelihood, are forced to employ all their time in strolling to beg sustenance for their helpless infants who, as they grow up, either turn thieves for want of work, or leave their dear native country to go find work, to fight for the pretender in Spain, we'll talk about that, or sell themselves to the Barbados as indentured servants. So he's painting a picture of what you see when you walk the streets in Ireland. And you have just abject poverty, these really poor peasant women who have just a string of children behind them. And they have all that they can do, because they have these children, is beg for food, for money for food. Even the fathers have to do this. They do this, right? And he's saying that what often happens to these children is that they can't find work, and so they either become thieves or leave the country looking for work, and then to fight for the pretender in Spain. And so King James II had been given the boot, and this was his son who many Catholics in Ireland preferred over the King of England because he was Catholic, King of England Protestant. And so they kind of looked to him and wished he was in charge. And so that's why they call him the pretender, that the Catholics in Ireland looked to him or wanted him to assume the throne. And the British hated him. So that's who they're talking about. So he's painting the picture here of what's going on in the culture, what he sees when he walks about, and this is what we're seeing turn out from these children. I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious, meaning great number of children in the arms or on the backs or at the heels of their mothers, they're everywhere. They're holding them, they're carrying them, they're like all around, and frequently their fathers, is in the present deplorable, negative, horrible, horrific state of the kingdom a very great additional grievance. A grievance is something burdening you down. So all of these poor children, so numerous you can barely count them, right, are a horrible strain and very pathetic and sad sight. And therefore, whoever could find out a fair, cheap, and easy method of making these children sound and useful members of the Commonwealth would deserve so well of the public as to have a statue set up for a preserver of the nation, right? So someone needs to come up with a solution. And that person, whoever comes up with the solution, should have a statue, especially one that does something for them that's fair and cheap and easy. We need a solution for this. So he's very just blunt. He's just laying out the problem. And so we think about tone here, and the tone coming through is very straightforward and candid. Look at what we see. We need a solution to this. Everyone agrees that all of these children, the overpopulation of starving, poor, peasant children, we need to solve this. We need to address this. But my intention is very far from being confined to provide only for the children of professed beggars. So his idea, right, he's going to lay out this idea, is beyond just the children. It is of a much greater extent and shall take in the whole number of infants at a certain age. It's going to be for all of them who are born of parents in effect as little able to support them as those who demand our charity in the streets. So this solution is going to take all of these kids from parents who can't provide for them and provide. It's going to solve the issue. But my intention, okay, so next part. As to my own part, having turned my thoughts for many years upon this important subject and maturely weighed several schemes of our projectors, I have always found them grossly mistaken in their computation. So this is one of the areas where he now starts to bring in an object of criticism, because there's this concept of utilitarianism, very just like number crunching, matter of fact attitude of this for that. And it's absent of like compassion. It's just very computed. And so this was a common kind of theory of thought. It was just a kind of this a number system, not really looking at nuances, looking at things in black and white, useful or not useful, effective or not effective. I've always found them grossly mistaken in their computation. It is true, a child just dropped from its dam. Not like a dam like we think of holding back water. That actually means a female of a species that gives birth may be supported by her milk for a solar year with little other nourishment, at most not above the value of 2 shillings, which the mother may certainly get, or the value in scraps by her lawful occupation of begging. And it is exactly at 1 year old that I propose to provide for them in such a manner as, instead of being a charge upon their parents or the parish, or wanting food and raiment, which is clothing, for the rest of their lives they shall, on the contrary, contribute to the feeding and partly to the clothing of many thousands. So what he's saying is, like, a lot of people project at how much it will cost to provide for these poor children in terms of nourishment and clothing. And when they compute that, these utilitarian black and white people compute that, they look at like the whole life. And he's like, actually, when you look at it, the very first year, they are very cheap because they breastfeed. And so for that first year, it costs very little, 2 shillings maybe, to clothe them because the mother's feeding them. But at 1 year, when they start to eat food, right, then they get expensive, was the idea. So at 1 year is when we're going to solve this. And these children are actually going to contribute instead of cost. Going on then. This is another great advantage in my scheme. So very just straightforward, no emotion, very logical as he's trying to lay this out. He's trying to seem very detached and logical. It will prevent those voluntary abortions and that horrid practice of women murdering their bastard children, alas, too frequent among us, sacrificing the poor innocent babes, I doubt, more to avoid the expense than the shame, which would move tears and pity in the most savage and inhuman breast. So he's pointing to another issue that there's illicit abortions happening from women who find themselves pregnant, and he says they're not embarrassed that they got pregnant out of wedlock, not being married, as much as that they know they can't take care of the child. And so there's also a little bit of irony here, because as we get into this, right, and what he actually is, his modest proposal, it's as horrific as what he's saying abortion is. Little spoiler alert there before we get to it, if you don't really know where this is going yet. All right, but he's saying, right, my solution will prevent these abortions that are happening, that's too frequent, before these children are born. And that issue, that problem is going to be addressed and solved by my proposal as well. So like side benefit here, okay? The number of souls in this kingdom being usually reckoned 1.5 million, of these I calculate there may be about 200,000 couple whose wives are breeders, from which number I subtract 30,000 couple who are able to maintain their own children, although I apprehend or understand there cannot be so many under the present distresses of this kingdom. But this being granted, though, there will remain 170,000 breeders. So this gets very number crunching, very statistical, very matter of fact here. There's no human emotion. It just is like a numbers game, right? He's going down that there's this many couples, this many could actually supply or support their children, and then this many cannot. Now, here's where that gets a little bit of a criticism. The satire is starting to take aim at the British Empire, right? Saying that British oversight of 200,000 couples, only 30,000 because of British oversight and colonialism. That's a small fraction, right? Only 30,000 could actually afford, because of what's happening economically, to take care of their kids. And that means 170,000 families, women having babies, can't take care of their kids. I again subtract 50,000 for those who miscarry or whose children die by accident or disease within the year. So obvious tragedy of miscarriage and accident and disease, the loss of human life here. He just talks about it as though very matter-of-factly, no emotion, just straight numbers. There only remain 120,000 children of poor parents annually born. So he gets down to the number of this computation. This is how many we're actually talking about, 120,000 children. The question therefore is, how this number shall be reared and provided for, which, as I have already said, under the present situation of affairs, is utterly impossible by all the methods hitherto proposed. So nothing that we've tried to do so far is actually feasible. Nothing has happened. There's been no ground made to take care of these kids. For we can neither employ them in handicraft or agriculture, they neither build houses, in the country, nor cultivate land. They can very seldom pick up a livelihood by stealing till they arrive at 6 years old. So what's he saying about these children that are under 6 years old, right? They can't do anything. They just need to be cared for. They actually provide nothing. Very cold and calculating. These babies, we can't get them to work. They don't produce anything. Maybe at 6 years old, they can very seldom pick up a livelihood by stealing even, until they arrive at 6 years old. Okay? So maybe when they're thieves, except where they are of towardly parts, although I confess they learn the rudiments much earlier. So already, right, he's already hinting that at a very young age they learn that they have to steal to survive. So some are a little more mature than others and can do this. So during which time they can, however, be properly looked upon only as probationers, right? So up until 6 years of age, they're really just kind of on probation. We're waiting for them to start this life of crime. And as I've been informed by a principal gentleman in the county Cavan who protested to me that he never knew above 1 or 2 instances under the age of 6, even in part of the kingdom so renowned for the quickest proficiency in that art. So I've talked to people, and very few children under 6 years old actually become thieves, right? Okay, next part. And so he's trying to kind of define the problem in the parameters of this children between 1 and X age, 6, 7, 8, that they really serve no useful function. Again, very matter-of-fact, straightforward, no emotional investment here, no human compassion, just straight, trying to be straightly logical, but completely also treating humans as numbers and objects. I'm assured by our merchants that a boy or girl before 12 years old is no saleable commodity. And even when they come to this age, they will not yield above 3 pounds or 3 pounds and a half crown at most on the exchange. So even if we sold them into slavery, they wouldn't, number one, we can't sell them before 12 years old. They don't, no one will take them on as a servant, slavery or just a servant, indentured servitude. No one's going to take them on and what if they do, it's a tiny little amount of money, which cannot turn to account either to the parents or the kingdom, the charge of nutriments and rags having been at least 4 times of that value. So even if you could sell them into servanthood, you would not actually, you'd lose money. They would cost more than you would get from them in terms of work. All right, very matter of fact here of trying to, set up this train of logic or this line of reasoning as to as a very black and white logical pluses and minuses that they're worth very little, right? Dismissing any intrinsic human value. So already you should have a little bit of what's he saying about his culture? What's his criticism here that he's just so coldly and calculatingly talking about people, human beings, as pluses and minuses, as profit and loss. And so this is where it's now starting to get a little disturbing. And then we get to this. I shall now therefore humbly propose my own thoughts, which I hope will not be liable to the least objection. So I'm going to put this out there, and I don't think anyone should have a problem with it based on what I've said. And now we have a change here, a shift in not tone. I want you to catch that the tone that he started on of this this detached, logical, number crunching individual who's just kind of addressing society's woes and the fact that it must be dealt with and solved, now moves into a modest proposal. I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young healthy child well nursed is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout. So did you catch what he was saying? Now, why an American acquaintance in London? What that might be saying? Now, could that be? Think about the time period. When he wrote this, with what's happening in the Americas historically, right? When we're at 1729, not even to the American Revolution yet, but maybe some of the hardships that colonists were facing in America, they might have had to resort to this, perhaps. But we won't talk too much about that at this point. However, that the point being is that you can eat these 1-year-olds. It's delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food. And that's the modest proposal. And so now we can see that the word modest here actually is intentional, an intentional choice to be disturbing. That this is a reasonable offer that we eat these babies. And so this is where the satire is just hammered. It's like supposed to be a punch in the gut that now this voice we've been listening to that's logically laid out this problem is actually advocating cannibalism as a solution and cannibalism of infants. I do therefore humbly offer it, like I'm just putting it out there, to public consideration that of the 120,000 children already computed, 20,000 may be reserved for breed, whereof only 1/4 part to be males, which is more than we allow to sheep, black cattle, or swine. Do you see how he's trying to, he equates them with livestock. And so the horror only grows here. And my reason is that these children are seldom the fruits of marriage, a circumstance not much regarded by our savages. Therefore, one male will be sufficient to serve 4 females. It's meant to be highly disturbing and disgusting. Okay, the fact that their morality is completely erased here. We're gonna keep 20,000 as our breeders, 4-to-1 ratio, women to men. In fact, we see a lot of these children born out of wedlock anyway. So what's it matter? It becomes just so chilling at this point, intentionally. Again, so why would he what is he saying about the culture to suggest that this, what's the criticism of the culture in terms of facing and dealing with this issue? That's what we want to look at here. The remaining 100,000 may at a year old be offered in sale to the persons of quality and fortune through the kingdom, always advising the mother to let them suck plentifully in the last month so as to render them plump and fat for a good table. A child will make 2 dishes at an entertainment for friends, and when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish and seasoned with a little pepper or salt, will be very good boiled on the 4th day, especially in winter. And so the humanity is like completely, we're just talking as though we're talking about a piece of ham. We're talking about people. And in fact, like, we want to get them especially plumped up beforehand. And so this is meant to shock, disturb. Remember, satire, part of satire is to wake people up. So who is he trying to wake up? What is his criticism of them that they need to be woken up as well? Next part. I have reckoned upon a medium that a child just born will weigh 12 pounds, and in a solar year, if tolerably nursed, increaseth to 28 pounds. I grant this food will be somewhat dear, meaning expensive, and therefore very proper for landlords who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children. All right, and so this is kind of a key line to part of the answer to who he is criticizing, right? So he's so matter of fact here about even weight. So children have become meat in this equation, and that's intentional in terms of his tone. The tone is fairly consistent, but the topic and subject matter has like just dropped off into this dark, evil, calculating voice at this point. But here then, right? Here then is the landlords. They are profiting off the misery of the populace. So how do we know that? Is this line here. They have already devoured most of the parents. Now here doesn't it mean like they're eating the parents, right? But devoured here is like eating up their lives. The parents are laying out their lives being worked by these landlords. And so we see the landlords now taking like the full force of this criticism, because they are victimizing the people, are profiting off the people. And so the landlords can afford the children for their supper table. Infant's flesh will be in season throughout the year, but more plentiful in March and a little before and after. For we are told by a grave author, an eminent French physician, that fish being a prolific diet, there are more children born in Roman Catholic countries about 9 months after Lent than any other season. Therefore, reckoning a year after Lent, the markets will be more glutted than usual, because the number of popish infants is at least 3 to 1 in this kingdom, and therefore it will have one other collateral advantage by lessening the number of papists among us. So now this is kind of weird if you don't know any of this history. The English would be Protestant, and the Irish would be Catholics. And so there is this tension in Ireland that the wealthy British have come into Ireland and are kind of controlling the population, and the population is mostly Catholic. So there's now a tension between faiths here as well. And so the speaker here would be Protestant, which is a type of a branch of Christianity, right? Or a branch of Christianity. We'll leave it at that. We're not going to get too deep into that. But and then the masses in Ireland are Roman Catholic. So Lent is a period in which you abstain from earthly pleasures, whether it's food or perhaps sexual activity. And so right after Lent, you have people that have been abstaining. All of a sudden, there's a kind of a baby boom 9 months after Lent is over, right? For that year after that. And so he's suggesting, like, we have overpopulation in Ireland of Catholics, and so this will lessen their numbers as well. So again, it's supposed to be shocking here that you would think people of faith would not have these kinds of thoughts of decimating or lessening a population of anybody. But again, the purpose of the satire is to point out perhaps little being done by those in power to help the needs of the poor, but also the poor perhaps not standing up, not fighting back, and just trudging through their lives in their misery. And we'll see that come out a little bit, right? So the next part. I have already computed the charge of nursing a beggar's child, in which list I reckon all cottagers, laborers, and 4/5 of the farmers to be about 2 shillings per annum, rags included, and I believe no gentleman would repine to give 10 shillings for the carcass of a good fat child, which, as I have said, will make 4 dishes of excellent nutritive meat, when he hath only some particular friend or his own family to dine with him. Thus the squire will learn to be a good landlord and grow popular among his tenants. The mother will have 8 shillings neat profit and will be fit for work till she produces another child. Right? So now he's starting to include his criticism of the Irish masses here, as well as complacent in their poverty and misery, maybe even complicit, because now what he's saying is we're going to get an exchange here, that the poor woman will only cost her 2 shillings to feed her child, but she's going to get 10 shillings, so a net profit of 8 for her, and then she can still work because she's not taking care of the child. So the landlord will be popular because he's paying them and they're getting more money. They'll have money, right? And then the people will be able to work still and not be burdened by all of these children that make them have to beg. Those who are more thrifty, as I must confess the times require, so again a little barb at British colonialism and the stranglehold that England had on the economy, right? May flay the carcass, meaning to take the skin off. So really just disturbing imagery. The skin of which, artificially dressed, will make admirable gloves for ladies and summer boots for fine gentlemen. So he just does not let up in just hammering the inhumanity, the brutalness of what he's proposing, even though he's still talking as though it's a modest proposal. That men will have boots made out of the skin of babies and women can wear gloves. As to our city of Dublin, shambles, which is a butcher shop, may be appointed for this purpose in the most convenient parts of it, and butchers, we may be assured, will not be wanting. So butchers are going to line up to be part of this profitable venture. Although I rather recommend buying the children alive and dressing them hot from the knife as we do roasting pigs. Again, evil, horrific, that to talk of people in the manner as we talk of livestock. A very worthy person, a true lover of his country, and whose virtues I highly esteem, was lately pleased in discoursing on this matter. Okay? So playing up that people of good reputation are on board with this, right? That this person then also said, hey, how about this? As so the picture here is of logical, important people are talking as though this is viable. So it's this whole idea of detached from the horrificness of it to just be like, this is a business venture. So here was the refinement offered by this true lover of his country. He said that many gentlemen of this kingdom, having late destroyed their deer, in other words, they're running out of venison, he conceived that the want of venison, or the lack of venison, might be well supplied by the bodies of young lads and maidens, not exceeding 14 years of age, nor under 12, so great a number of both sexes in every country being now ready to starve for want of work and service, and these to be disposed of by their parents if alive, or otherwise by their nearest relations. But with due deference to so excellent a friend, and so deserving a patriot, I cannot be altogether in his sentiments. So just matter-of-factly debating a little bit the merits of, hey, what about these teenagers who are not really going to be able to work, and they're just kind of a burden as well? We should eat them too. That was what his friend suggested. And so he's like, he's taking exception to that. And he's saying, this is why. As to the males, my American acquaintance assured me from frequent experience that their flesh was generally tough and lean, like that of our schoolboys, by continual exercise, and their taste disagreeable, and to fatten them would not answer the charge. Then as to the females, it would think, with humble submission, to be a loss to the public, because they soon would become breeders themselves. And so the reason that that's not a good idea is not because you're murdering people and eating them. It's because, one, they don't taste very good, and two, the females will actually be able to produce the food that we're actually talking about here. So then, and besides, it is not improbable that some scrupulous, meaning people that have morals, might be apt to censure such a practice. So there's going to be people that are like, that's wrong, although it indeed is very unjustly, as a little bordering on cruelty. So look at this, kind of like playing it down. A little bordering upon cruelty, which I confess has always been with me the strongest objection against any project, how well soever intended. So, like, equating his proposal with just any proposal that, especially utilitarian proposal, that it just doesn't take into consideration the human component. So any of these proposals that are just talking about black and white, plus and minuses, we could say all of those are cruel. And so he's actually putting his proposal on par with any other utilitarian proposal. But in order to justify my friend, he confessed that this little expedient was put into his head by the famous Salmanzar, a native of the island Formosa, who came from thence to London about 20 years ago, and in conversation told my friend that in his country, when any young person happened to be put to death, the executioner sold the carcass to persons of quality as a prime dainty. So a word meaning a tasty dish. And that in his time, the body of a plump girl of 15 who was crucified for an attempt to poison the emperor was sold to his imperial majesty's prime minister of state and other great mandarins of the court in joints from the gibbet at 400 crowns. Neither indeed can I deny that if the same use were made of several plump young girls in this town, who without one single groat to their fortunes cannot stir abroad without a chair and appear at a playhouse and assemblies and foreign fineries which they will never pay for, the kingdom would not be the worst. Right? So he's given like this example from some other country. He's probably trying to pick, characterize it as less civilized, or their cannibalism is acceptable there. And if it's fine for them, why not for us? That if they, for this reason, were able to sell and eat a young woman, that perhaps it would be just fine here. Rather than being a burden on society, they wouldn't be missed if we did that. Some persons of a desponding spirit are in great concern about the vast number of poor people who are aged, diseased, or maimed, and have been desired to employ my thoughts what course may be taken to ease the nation of so grievous an encumbrance. So he's kind of broadening or widening the audience, or the issue here. What about the older people that are also a burden? So the whole wide spectrum here, right? These older people that are also a burden. But I'm not in the least pain upon that matter, because it is very well known that they are every day dying and rotting by cold and famine and filth and vermin as fast as can be reasonably expected. So pointing out by saying this portion of the population we don't need to worry about because they're dying, he's pointing out all of the horrible things that they're enduring: cold and famine, filth, rats that are killing the older part of the population. And as to the young laborers, they are now in almost as hopeful a condition. Now, that word hopeful is not meaning hopeful, because these people are not in a hopeful condition. They're in a dreadful condition. They cannot get work and consequently pine away from want of nourishment to a degree that if at any time they are accidentally hired to common labor, they have not strength to perform it, and thus the country and themselves are happily delivered from the evils to come. Right? So regardless of people's age, they can't work. There is no work for the most part. And if they could work, they're so hungry and malnourished that they don't have the energy to do so. So this would solve that issue of people finding themselves in this situation. So I have too long digressed, meaning gone off topic, and therefore shall return to my subject. I think the advantages by the proposal which I have made are obvious in many, as well as of the highest importance. Okay? And so then he goes through, what are the advantages of eating these 1-year-old babies of the poor? So for first, I'm going to quickly go through these. Right? First of all, it's going to reduce the number of Catholics because that's the largest part of the population, and because there is tension between these two factions, right? So when it comes to the native Catholics versus the imperialistic Protestants that are here in this time, right? There are most dangerous enemies. There are enemies to they're not happy with British rule. They stay at home on purpose with the design to deliver the kingdom to the pretender, hoping to take their advantage by the absence of so many good Protestants who have chosen rather to leave their country than stay at home and pay tithes against their conscience to episcopal curate. So he's criticizing all parts of the population here, right? The people from Britain that have come and are there, and then also the people of Ireland who are not taking action out of their own poverty. Okay, secondly, so here's the second one. The poor tenants will have something valuable of their own, which by law may be made liable to a distress and help pay their landlord's rent. So, in other words, the poor will actually now have money. And so this is where we can see that part of his criticism is on the, not necessarily being complicit, but the lack of action the inaction of this population that's suffering under British rule, right? So that's the second one. Third, whereas the maintenance of 100,000 children from 2 years old and upwards cannot be computed at less than this, the nation's stock will be thereby increased. So in other words, it's a money thing where we were at a loss, now we'll be at a profit. Fourth, right, the women, besides the gain of 8 shillings, they will be now not have to take care of the kids either. So they'll get the money and then they don't have to have the burden of taking care. Again, cold calculating, but also trying to criticize that the people here would in poverty would accept this. That he's trying to perhaps shock them into action to stand up to the British Empire. Fifthly, this food would likewise bring great customs to taverns. So there's more money, so people go out to eat. Right? They have their houses frequented by all the fine gentlemen who justly value themselves upon their knowledge and good eating. So it's going to help the economy. Sixth, it would be a great inducement to marriage. In other words, being together and producing children is profitable. And we would also see men would become as fond of their wives during the time of their pregnancy, especially. So he's actually, saying, and there will be less domestic violence because the men will just like they take care of a cow that's in calf, because that's going to be more meat. It's going to be the same thing here for these relationships that they're now financially profitable. Many other advantages might be enumerated. So in other words, I can come up with even more. Because we're eating the kids, right? We can export more beef, and we can do better from what we do because we're eating our own meat, and we could sell that then, right? So there's that idea there. Supposing that 1,000 families in the city would be constant customers, the Dublin would take off annually about 20,000 carcasses. So here in Dublin, Ireland, we would have where a lot of the wealthy was concentrated. We would take this many, and then we could sell the rest within the country. All right, now this is where part of the passage becomes very interesting, and you'll have to kind of read through this. And this is where his frustration, Swift's friends, we got to differentiate between the voice in this, the voice of the speaker here and Swift. This is not Swift telling his feelings. This is a satire. So it's a persona of Swift that's coming out here. Okay, so it's a persona. And so this is where Swift's frustration comes out. Okay? And this is where I can think of no one objection that will possibly be raised against this proposal unless it should be urged that the number of people will be thereby much lessened in the kingdom. So the only thing that people might object to is that there will be less people. This I freely own was indeed one principal design. I desire the reader will observe that I calculate my remedy for this individual kingdom of Ireland and for no other that ever was, is, or I think can ever be. So he's trying to say this is just for Ireland. And then here's the key. Therefore, let no man talk to me of other expedients. And then there's a list. These are the things, as he goes through these, that Swift is frustrated that no one will listen to, because he was continually trying to put ideas up towards the government to do something about the starving and the poverty and the absolute overbearing grip that Britain had that was causing such anguish among the population. And so these are all things, when you see the of, these are all things that he knows and he's actually saying are solutions. All of these are solutions that we should be doing, but no one's listening to him. And so this is where putting forward such a disturbing, despicable, inhumane, evil idea is supposed to shock people out of their complacency. Don't cause misery. And also don't allow yourselves to be used and destroyed by this colonialization, the stranglehold that the government has on you. And these are actually all things that would be viable and humane solutions. And he's like, don't talk to me about that. He's saying that because no one listens to him and what he's saying. Swift is saying, you don't listen to reason. So I'm going to give you something that's going to wake you up. And this is what the whole reason is behind this, the modest proposal. Okay? So therefore, I repeat, let no man talk to me of these and the like expedients till he hath at least some glimpse of hope that there will be ever some hearty and sincere attempt to put them into practice. Right? This is where the satire is pointed at. Don't tell me that this plan is evil when the evil that you do by your ignorance and your lack of doing anything about this disturbing decay of these people is actually sincere, and you will stand up and do what's right. That's awesome, right? And so the rest of this says right here, as to myself. And so now this is kind of where Swift's voice is coming out. Having been wearied out for many years with offering vain, idle, visionary thoughts, and at length utterly despairing of success. This is how he's feeling inside. And so this is why he comes forward with the satire, even though the voice now comes back when he says, I fortunately fell upon this proposal, right? Which, as it is wholly new, so has something solid and real. In other words, it's actually something, some action steps that doesn't really cost anything and really won't inconvenience you, right? So this is a criticism in full bore here, that you won't really do anything because you don't want to be bothered, inconvenienced, or you don't want it to cost you anything. So how about this then? This is where that kind of attitude leads to. Okay? For this kind of commodity will not bear exportation, and flesh being too tender a consistence to admit a long continuance in salt, although perhaps I could name a country which would be glad to eat up our whole nation without it. So here's the attack on Ireland and Britain. That we would have, we would be forced to eat the young here, although Britain would be happy to completely devour this country and spit it out. All right. And so the rest of this here, as it goes through, and we're not going to spend as much time here, is to kind of just say, basically, this is a good solution. And as you go through this last part, right, I'm not so violently bent upon my own opinion to reject any offer proposed by wise men, which shall be found equally innocent. But before that, something of that kind shall be advanced in contradiction of my own scheme. I desire the authors will be pleased maturely to consider 2 points. So if you want to do something different, you have to consider these 2 points, right? First of all, how are you going to solve this problem? How will they be able to find food and raiment for 100,000 useless mouths and back? So how are you going to address this? And then the second thing is, why don't you go ask the people that are suffering if they rather would have just died early instead of living a life of misery that you have caused, right? Is what this goes down to. And then the last paragraph here is kind of letting himself as the speaker, not Swift, but the speaker off the hook, saying, I'm not going to gain anything from this because I don't have kids, which I could make any money off of, right? So it's like this little escape clause here. If you're like, what's in it? You're evil, and you accusations of selfish self-profit or anything. He's kind of saying, I can't make anything off of this because my wife can't have more kids and my kids aren't young enough. And so it almost becomes even darker in his calculating, because he's saying, I'm just being generous with this offer. It's reasonable. All right, so there it is. This, and hopefully you can see that how sometimes satire is, I wouldn't say necessarily a last resort, but it's an attempt or a means by which people can be woken up from the blindness that they may have, or the comfort, just being comfortable that they may have about injustice, and that there's things right in front of them that should not be, that are actually evil. And so he almost is like, pedal to the metal of evil to point out the evil of doing nothing. So hopefully that was helpful with this. I know it was long, but this was kind of a long piece of work as well. But very much worth it to go into this to understand it better. Hey, thanks for watching. We would love it if you could subscribe to the channel. Here's other videos in our writing workshop series and a couple other playlists that, hey, you could help us out and maybe enjoy a little bit. Until next time.